They laughed at the sight of her, a lone black woman wandering aimlessly along a muddy Maryland road at dusk. To the slave catchers lounging on the porch of the country tavern, she looked like no more than a ragged drifter. She limped as she walked, leaning on a stick, head bowed under an old scarf. A couple of them nudged each other and chuckled. This was the infamous runaway they'd been warned about. Surely not. Surely this tiny, wary-looking creature wasn't the one who'd been slipping through their fingers night after night. One of the men stepped forward, hand on his whip, and called out to her, "Evelyn! Auntie! You look lost. Where you heading so late?" His tone was mocking, dripping with false sweetness. The others snickered. The woman barely glanced up. In the fading light, her face looked young but worn, the face of someone who'd known hardship and hunger. She mumbled something about trying to find a place to sleep. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Well now, isn't that sad?" The leader of the posse drawled, theatrically rolling his eyes at his comrades. "Maybe we can help you, gal. Why don't you come on inside? We got a nice warm fire. Some food, maybe." He flashed a predatory grin. The men behind him fanned out casually, blocking the road. They exchanged confident smirks. It was the grin of hunters who believed their prey had wandered right into their trap. But the woman did not walk into their trap. Instead, she wavered on her feet as if light-headed. Without a word, she suddenly sank to her knees in the road. One of the younger men barked a laugh. "Lord, she's fainted!" he cackled. Sure enough, the woman had slumped over, motionless in the dirt. The catchers glanced at each other, momentarily unsure. Was this a trick, or had she really just collapsed from fear or exhaustion? "Get her up." The leader muttered, annoyed that this capture wasn't going to be any sport at all. Two of them strode over and lifted the limp figure by her arms. Her head lolled, her eyes were shut. She hung between them like a rag doll. "Ow, she's done tuckered out," one man chuckled, prodding her cheek with a gloved finger. She didn't react. The posse leader stepped closer, bringing a lantern near her face. He wanted to see the features of this pathetic runaway who'd given them so much trouble. Suddenly, the woman's eyes snapped open. For one split second, they locked onto his. He saw not fear in those eyes, but fire. Before he could draw breath, her arms jerked free of the men's grip with startling strength. In a blur, she swung her wooden walking stick up and around. The lantern shattered, plunging the road into darkness. Curses erupted. In the confusion, someone lunged and grabbed at the spot where she'd been, but grasped only empty air. A shout. "She's running." They stumbled in the sudden dark, drawing pistols, firing blind. Flashes lit up silhouettes of trees and kicking horses. But the woman was gone. Vanished into the night as if she'd never been there at all. When they finally managed to relight a lantern, the road was empty. Just the cracked glass of the fallen lamp at their feet and the echo of their own heavy breathing. The slave catchers stood there in disbelief and embarrassment. A frail, looking woman had slipped right out of their hands. They had laughed at her, underestimated her every step of the way, and now she'd made fools of them. The taste of humiliation was bitter. They had been so confident, so certain of their power. They never even realized that from the very start, she was the one setting the trap for them. She would not be the last to do so, either. By the time that night was over, those mighty hunters would be stumbling through the swamps until dawn, drugged by exhaustion and confusion, swatting at mosquitoes and cursing her name. They didn't know it yet, but the woman who had outwitted them was Harriet Tubman, and this night was just one small battle in a much larger war, a war she was quietly winning. This is the story of how an enslaved girl, abused and underestimated from birth, became the South's most elusive rebel. To understand how Harriet Tubman defied an empire and dismantled an oppressive system without ever firing a shot, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the world that tried and failed to break her. The slave catchers had every reason to feel confident that evening, or so they thought. For years, they had been the enforcers of an entire way of life built on power and fear. In the slaveholding South, men like them rode with impunity, armed with whips and guns, backed by laws that treated people as property. They considered themselves unbeatable in their world. After all, how could an illiterate black woman possibly challenge the might of slave owners, the teeth of bloodhounds, and the barrels of their guns. Plantation owners and their hired hunters saw Harriet not as a strategist or an enemy to respect, but as a nuisance to swat away. In their eyes, she was nothing more than a diminutive fugitive, a piece of human property gone astray. They told each other that she was bound to slip up soon. That sooner or later, she'd make a mistake, get lost in the woods, or trust the wrong person, or simply starve out there in the wild. She was a woman, after all, and a black woman at that. To their minds, she lacked the intellect and endurance to evade them for long. They convinced themselves that every escape she pulled off was just luck, a fluke that couldn't continue. Such was the arrogance of the slaveholding class. They traded rumors about the mysterious Moses spiriting away slaves, but scoffed at the idea that a lone black woman was behind it. Some were certain a network of white abolitionists had to be the real masterminds. Surely a slave couldn't outwit them on her own. Their confidence was bolstered by the laws stacked in their favor. By 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act made even the free states in the North hunting grounds for slave catchers. Armed with this federal law, these men believed they were unstoppable. They boasted that no matter where a runaway tried to hide, Maryland, Pennsylvania, or even far off Canada, they would track them down and drag them back in chains. It was manifest destiny turned on its head. They saw it as their god, given right to rule over people like Harriet forever. So they laughed, bragged, and relaxed into complacency. Slave catchers swapped stories over whiskey about how easily they had caught other runaways, chuckling that this Tubman woman would be no different. She was predictable, they claimed. Eventually she'd show up trying to free the wrong slave from the wrong plantation and fall right into their trap. Her luck would run out. They could imagine the satisfying scene: Harriet Tubman, chained and defeated, paraded back to her former master as an example to any slave daring enough to follow her path. That image comforted them. It reassured them that their power was intact, unthreatened. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't even begin to fathom, was that Harriet Tubman had built her success not on luck, but on an intimate understanding of their own blind spots. She knew their arrogance was their weakness. She knew they'd underestimate her at every turn, and she intended to use that, again and again, to outfox them. The hunters were so busy believing in their own supremacy that they never considered the truth. While they thought her weak, predictable, and beatable, she was quietly rewriting the rules of the game right under their noses. Araminta Ross was born into bondage in the early 1820s on Maryland's eastern shore. She would later rename herself Harriet, after her mother, but at birth she was just Minty, another black child condemned to slavery from her first breath. The world she opened her eyes to was one designed to crush the spirit. As a toddler she was taught that she was property, someone else's asset to be worked, controlled, and, if they saw fit, sold. The plantation in Dorchester County, where Minty spent her early years, was small and poor, but that hardly softened the life of an enslaved girl. Her parents, Harriet, Rit, Green, and Ben Ross, tried to shield their children with love and stories in the flickering light of their cabin's hearth at night. But by day, Rit and Ben's 9 children were at the mercy of masters and overseers. Minty's older sisters were sold away to distant plantations, one by one, disappearing from her life forever. Imagine being a little girl and watching your siblings simply vanish, knowing they were likely to a fate of endless toil and abuse in the Deep South. It left a scar that never truly healed. Each loss was a lesson written in agony under slavery. Nothing and no one you loved was safe. As soon as she could walk and carry a pail, Minty was put to work. At 5 or 6 years old, she was hired out to a neighboring farm as a nursemaid for an infant. Her job was to watch over the baby day and night, and if it cried, Minty's owner expected her to quiet it. How does a 5-year-old stop a wailing infant? She couldn't. When the baby's cries woke the household, Minty was whipped. One day, in desperation, the child tried to hide from her mistress instead of coming when called. For that, she was beaten and made to go without food. She later recounted how she was lashed 5 times before breakfast one morning. Welts crossed her small body, but even worse was the indignity and terror that sank deep into her soul. She was just a child, yet in slavery even children found no mercy. Over the years, Minty was passed around to different masters. If she fell ill from the cold or exhaustion, her value to them vanished, and she would be sent back, half-starved, to her home plantation until she recovered enough to be rented out again. Once, she was forced to work as a trapper, checking muskrat traps in frigid marshes. She fell sick with the measles, and half drowned and shivering, was dumped back at her mother's cabin to either get well or die. But Minty didn't die. Somehow, through fever and pain, she pulled through. There was a hardness growing in her, a resilience tempered by suffering. Any other child might have been broken completely, but not Minty. Her most fateful trial came when she was around 12 or 13. One day, she was sent to a local dry goods store, likely on an errand for her master. In the store, she witnessed an enslaved young man attempting to flee from an overseer. The overseer demanded Minty help restrain the runaway. Terrified and defiant, Minty refused and stood in the doorway, shielding the man's escape. To teach her a lesson, the overseer grabbed a cast iron weight. Some accounts say it was a 2-pound lead weight used for the scales, and hurled it at the fleeing slave. He missed his target. The heavy weight struck Minty square in the forehead. She was knocked out cold. Blood gushed from her head onto the wooden floorboards. The overseer, cursing, picked up the weight, and the runaway got away in the confusion. Minty's body was carried back to her enslaver's house and laid on a bench. There she lay, untreated, for days. Her skull was fractured. She drifted in and out of consciousness. By all rights, she should have died. The people around her certainly thought she would. She was just another injured slave, not worth a doctor's fee. But against all odds, Minty survived. When she finally rose from that bed, there was a deep scar on her forehead and something new in her mind. The head injury left her with lifelong epilepsy, like episodes. At unpredictable moments, she would be overcome by sudden deep sleeps or vivid visions. She could be in the middle of a task and suddenly collapse into a dreamlike trance. Her family feared for her. Her masters saw her as troublesome and useless. When she blacked out. But Minty herself began to experience those spells as something more than just an affliction. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw bright scenes and felt a powerful presence. She described them as messages from God. The injury that could have killed her instead awakened a fierce faith inside her. She became devout, speaking to God as if conversing with a trusted friend. Her belief wasn't the meek submission that slaveholders tried to instill with their distorted Bible verses. It was the kind of faith that could ignite rebellion in a person's heart. In those trances, she found comfort, guidance, and an iron resolve. Over time, Minty came to believe that she was kept alive for a reason. As she grew into her late teens, she was small in stature, but dense with muscle from years of hard labor. She worked as a field hand, hefting heavy loads that would stagger grown men. The same girl, who had once been deemed too frail for work, now had calloused hands and shoulders hardened by chopping wood and driving oxen. If the overseers thought the blow to her head had shattered her, they were wrong. It had forged her. Outwardly, she still endured the torments of slavery, whippings, hunger, endless toil, but inside, Minty nurtured a quiet, seething determination. In 1844, around age 22, she married a free black man named John Tubman. It was a curious union. She was enslaved and he was free. In the eyes of the law, any children they had would still belong to her master. John Tubman likely loved her, but he also believed she should stay obedient and not seek escape. He had carved out a tenuous place for himself in that society and feared what would happen if his wife ran. More than once he warned her not to run north. He even threatened to turn her in if she tried. For all his love, John was a man who had learned to accept the world as it was. Minty had not. Living with one foot in freedom and the other in chains only intensified her restlessness. The tipping point came in 1849. Minty's master, a young man named Edward Brodess, died suddenly. His death meant his estate would be settled and his slaves very likely sold off to the highest bidder. Minty heard whispers that she and her brothers were to be sold downriver, deeper into the south, where the plantations were hellish and the chance of ever seeing her family again was near zero. She had seen too many others swallowed by that fate. She made up her mind that she would not be next. She prayed for guidance and perhaps for divine intervention. But this time, the answer that came to her was one she would deliver with her own 2 feet. Minty, Harriet, as she now called herself, decided to seize her fate. If her owner's hares were going to sell her, she would leave on her own terms, under the cover of night. It was time, at last, to run. In the autumn of 1849, under a sky of brilliant stars, Harriet Tubman ran. She slipped away from the Brodess farm in the dark, taking her chances on the swampy paths and winding creeks that stretched north. At around 27 years old, she was escaping slavery alone. All she carried were a little food, a flask of water, and an iron determination. Following the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper and the North Star, she walked by night and hid by day. She crept through woods, waded chest, deep through rivers to throw off the dogs, and moved steadily toward freedom. At first, she wasn't truly alone. Harriet had attempted to escape with 2 of her brothers, but fear got the better of them. After a day or 2 out, her brothers panicked, terrified of the unknown ahead and the pursuers surely behind. They insisted on turning back. Harriet faced an agonizing choice: go with them to certain punishment, or press on alone. She chose to continue. She had come too far and endured too much to give up now. Her brothers turned back under cover of darkness, leaving Harriet to forge ahead into the wilderness with only her faith for company. She would later recall that moment with characteristic resolve. She said she had reasoned it out in her mind that she had a right to one of 2 things: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. There would be no turning back for her. The journey was harrowing. The specter of capture hounded her steps. She knew the woods and marshes from a lifetime of labor, and now she used that knowledge to survive. One dawn, hearing the distant bay of hounds, she jumped into an icy stream and floated along it to hide her scent, clinging to a log until the barking faded. On another night, hungry and footsore, she knocked on the door of a stranger whose name she'd been given by a sympathetic Methodist preacher. It was a perilous gamble. If the stranger betrayed her, it would mean chains. But the door opened, and a kind Quaker farmer ushered her in, fed her, and hid her in a wagon under sacks of grain. The network of quiet allies that would later be called the Underground Railroad was beginning to show itself. At each stop, she was passed to the next secret helper: black, white, religious, daring souls who hated slavery and risked their own safety to help her on her way. After days of travel and countless close calls, Harriet Tubman crossed the invisible line that marked the border into Pennsylvania, a free state. It was as if she had crossed from night into day. Later, she struggled to describe the moment. "When I found I had crossed that line," she said, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." For the first time in her life, Harriet was free. No master's whip could reach her now. No auctioneer could sell her away. She had secured her liberty with her own 2 feet and unbreakable will. And yet, standing on free soil, Harriet felt no simple triumph. Instead, a profound loneliness washed over her. "I was a stranger in a strange land," she remembered. She was free, yes, but what was freedom worth when her family and friends remained enslaved? Her husband was far behind in Maryland, and though he was free, he hadn't come with her. Her parents, her brothers who had turned back, her sisters and their children, all were still in bondage. Harriet knew their fates. If they tried to run, who would guide them? If they stayed, who would protect them? In that moment, she understood that her personal freedom was only the beginning of a much longer journey. In Philadelphia, Harriet found work and shelter among abolitionists. She scrubbed floors and hauled loads at the docks, saving every penny she could from her meager wages. Most escapees would have settled into this new life, grateful just to be alive and free. Friends warned her to lie low. Slave catchers roamed even northern cities looking for easy bounties. If she was caught in Pennsylvania, the law would drag her back to slavery. But Harriet Tubman's mind was elsewhere, down south with her family. Every night she lay her head down and was visited by their faces in her dreams. She could almost hear her father's voice, her mother's singing, the laughter of a niece or nephew playing in the dirt. She knew the kind of suffering that went on day after day back on those plantations, and now she knew something else. that it was possible to escape. She had done it. She had cracked the door open. How could she not go back and pull others through it? Within a year of reaching freedom, Harriet made the decision that astonished everyone around her. She would return to Maryland to rescue her family. It was practically unheard of. Escaped slaves rarely tempted fate by going back. But for Harriet, it did not feel like a choice at all. It felt like a calling, clear and inexorable. Quietly, she prepared herself, gathering information, studying maps by candlelight, even though she couldn't read the words, committing the shapes of rivers and roads to memory. She learned from Underground Railroad contacts about safe routes and friendly houses. Each Sunday at church in Philadelphia, she prayed not for her own safety, but for guidance, how to do what she was about to do. And each time, her resolve only strengthened. She later said, "Matter of factly, I was free, and they should be free." One crisp evening, Harriet stepped onto a southbound train, wearing a borrowed suit of men's clothing and carrying a folded newspaper. She could not read. She had transformed herself from the timid, Minty, who once cowered under an overseer's lash, into a steely-eyed conductor of her own destiny. As the steam engine chugged into the night, Harriet Tubman was headed back into the abyss she had escaped, this time by her own choosing. It was the beginning of something historic. She was going back to wage a one-woman war for those she left behind. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. Harriet Tubman's greatest weapons were not guns or knives, but the elements of perception, darkness, deception, fear, faith, and the keen knowledge of how her enemies thought. She learned to turn every assumed weakness into strength. Slave catchers expected runaways to be ignorant, scared, and disorganized. Harriet made sure they saw what they expected. Until it was too late. Night was her ally. Harriet almost always led her escape parties after sunset. She favored the winter months when nights were long and moonlight scarce. In the black of night, a line of escapees could slip through forests and across back roads with little chance of being spotted. Where others might fear the dark and the eerie stillness of swamps at midnight, Harriet reveled in them. She knew every star by name, every owl call and frog croak. The woods where slave catchers blundered with torches and dogs, she navigated like a ghost. Many times pursuers thought they had cornered her group, only to find nothing but empty woods, because Harriet had doubled back behind them under the cover of darkness. To the frustrated men with guns, it was as if she could disappear at will. She also understood the power of timing and misinformation. She often began escapes on Saturday nights. Why? Because she knew that runaway notices wouldn't appear in newspapers until Monday morning. The presses didn't run on Sunday. Those extra hours of head start could mean the difference between reaching the next safe house or being overtaken. By the time anyone knew to look for Harriet's group, they were already days up the road. It was a simple trick, but devastatingly effective against a bureaucracy that moved slower than a determined woman on foot. Harriet mastered disguises and misdirection to hide in plain sight. On her forays back into Maryland, she might dress as a man one trip, then as an elderly woman the next. She carried props, a bonnet and a shawl to appear as a harmless granny on her way to market, or a pair of chickens to sell. Once, while scouting a town for escapees, she recognized a former enslaver approaching on the street. In that tense moment, instead of turning and bolting, which would have drawn attention, Harriet coolly improvised. She grabbed the 2 live chickens she had with her and let them loose. As the startled birds flapped and squawked, she fussed and chased them in a comic display. The man coming toward her barely gave a second glance to the silly old woman scrambling after her chickens. He certainly did not realize that the woman under that ragged shawl was the very Harriet Tubman he sought. By the time he moved on, Harriet had slipped down a side alley and vanished. On another occasion, Harriet boarded a southbound train, an incredibly bold move for a fugitive, to reach slaves in need of rescue. A conductor on that train was actually an old acquaintance who might have recognized her. Before he could come down the aisle, Harriet pulled out a newspaper and held it up, as if deeply engrossed in reading. She was illiterate and couldn't decipher a word on the page, but she knew the man would think, "It can't possibly be her. Harriet can't read." The ruse worked. He passed by without a word. She had used the very fact of her illiteracy as camouflage, turning a limitation into an asset. Perhaps her most crucial skill was psychological control over others and herself. Harriet projected confidence and authority that belied her petite stature. She had to, leading terrified people across hostile territory required it. If someone lost their nerve, the whole group could be compromised. So she became a master at managing fear. Sometimes that meant prayer and reassurance. She'd softly sing a familiar hymn like, "Go down, Moses," to lift spirits and signal safety. Other times it meant stern, uncompromising resolve. She carried a small pistol on her missions, primarily for protection, but also as a last resort to prevent betrayal from within. There are accounts of moments when exhaustion and dread pushed one of her fugitives to want to turn back. Turning back was not an option. Anyone who returned would likely be tortured until they revealed everything about the route and those who helped. When one man insisted he couldn't go on and tried to leave, Harriet stepped in front of him, raised her pistol, and aimed it at his chest. Her voice was low and steady when she told him, "Go on or die." It was not a threat out of malice, it was the reality she had steeled herself to enforce. In that instant, Harriet herself became the thing to fear rather than the distant slave catchers. The man stayed, and the group pressed on. No one dared defy Harriet Tubman's orders after that. She had turned fear, normally the master's weapon, into her own. Beyond fear, she wielded faith like a shield. Those vivid visions and dreams she'd been left with after her head injury often came to her as warnings or guidance. If a voice in her sleep told her to take an unexpected detour, she did so without question, even if it perplexed her followers. Once she led a group through a river at a point that seemed too deep and dangerous. She couldn't swim, and some in the party panicked. But Harriet had dreamed of water the night before, a sign she interpreted as reassurance. She stepped in first and waded across, praying under her breath, and the others followed. They all made it, shivering but safe, and later learned that patrols had been waiting on the main road they originally planned to take. Her intuition, her faith, saved them from walking into an ambush they never even knew was there. To those she guided, it sometimes felt like Harriet had a divine foresight, as if God whispered to her how to avoid danger. Many of them believed, as Harriet did, that heavenly protection was the only explanation for how often they cheated death. In truth, it was also her clever reading of people and situations. Harriet could smell a trap or sense when informers were lurking. She would change plans abruptly if her gut told her something was off. Her unpredictability made it virtually impossible for slave hunters to anticipate her moves. They expected straight lines, she delivered zigzags. They expected panicked flight, she delivered calculated maneuver. Each dawn that Harriet and her group reached a safe hiding place while their pursuers rode in circles was a victory of brains over brawn. Sedatives, too, became part of her arsenal, the gentlest and strangest of weapons. On at least one rescue, Harriet found herself carrying a baby, whose cries could have been their undoing. In the dark woods, a single wail from an infant could echo and alert patrollers nearby. Harriet didn't hesitate. From her bag, she pulled a small bottle of paregoric, a tincture of opium. With a few drops on her fingertip, she soothed the infant's lips. The baby drifted into a heavy, peaceful sleep, and the group was able to remain absolutely silent as a posse passed not far away. Had the child cried, the hounds would have been on them in minutes. Instead, by using a simple medicine, Harriet robbed the hunters of their advantage. Time and again, she nullified the slave catchers' greatest tools, their dogs, their guns, their nerves, without ever directly confronting them. It was as if she knew the battlefield was in the mind. Confuse them, stay a step ahead of them, make them doubt what they thought they knew. This was how Harriet Tubman fought. She understood that in this struggle, psychological domination could matter more than a bullet, and so far, every time, her strategy was working. Trip by trip, year by year, Harriet Tubman's quiet crusade intensified. After that first daring return to Maryland, she did not stop. In fact, having successfully led one group to freedom, she became even bolder. She went back again, and again. Each mission was a fresh test of her ingenuity and courage, and each success emboldened her further. At first, she focused on family. She returned for her brothers, leading them out of Maryland in one bold strike under the winter sky. One frigid Christmas Eve, under the cover of celebrations when oversight was lax, Harriet led 3 of her brothers out of Dorchester County. She had sent word through a coded letter that she was coming for them, telling them to be ready to step aboard the all-ship of Zion, her way of signaling an escape. They trusted the message and their sister. On the appointed night, they slipped away from their cabins and met her at a prearranged spot in the woods. True to form, Harriet delivered them safely to the north. Her brothers were astonished at her fearlessness. She was no longer the little sister they had known, but a leader who seemed to know no fear of the white patrollers or the dogs. They began calling her Moses, half in jest at first, but the name stuck. Among those in the Maryland slave community, whispers spread of a figure who kept leading her people to the promised land of freedom. With each journey, Harriet's tactics evolved. She had always been cautious, but now she became positively wily. If one safe house was compromised, she developed alternate routes. She memorized backroads, swamps, and hideaways across an expanding radius. She forged new contacts, a German farmer here, a Quaker family there, a black preacher in another town, creating multiple overlapping paths to freedom. What began as a tiny footpath of escapees grew into a well-worn trail, and Harriet was the trailblazer. Her reputation was growing, too, though she tried to keep it quiet. Abolitionist networks in the North came to know Harriet Tubman as one of the most effective conductors. On the Underground Railroad, they marveled that this young woman had personally escorted dozens of fugitives and never lost a single one. In Philadelphia and New York, she met prominent abolitionists who provided funds or shelter for her missions. Like a secret agent in enemy territory, she coordinated with these allies to set up safe havens, and she passed along intelligence about the attitudes and movements of slave catchers in Maryland. Back in the slave-holding South, however, her successes did not go unnoticed. Plantation owners were furious and alarmed at the trickle of human property disappearing from under their noses. The trickle wasn't large Harriet freed people in the tens, not hundreds, but it was the principle of it. She was defying the system openly and repeatedly, making the powerful look inept. As her tally of rescued souls grew, so did the determination of slaveholders to stop her. They beefed up patrols during times they suspected Moses was around. They offered rewards for information leading to her capture. News of her exploits began to appear in Southern newspapers, though they often portrayed the escapes as the work of white agitators or organized gangs of Negro thieves from the North. It was perhaps too humiliating to admit that one small black woman was outmaneuvering them all. As early as 1852, wanted posters appeared in Maryland offering substantial bounties for the capture of Harriet Tubman or for Moses. Whatever her true identity was, since not all knew her face. One advertisement described her as about 5 feet tall, with a slight build and a noticeable scar on her head. The reward sums mentioned varied to 300 here, the 500 there, hefty sums for the time. As her legend grew, so did the legends about the bounty on her head. Years later, tales would circulate that slaveholders had pooled 40,000 for her capture, dead or alive. That figure was likely exaggerated by admirers to underscore her importance, but it is telling that people believed it. The reality was frightening enough. Any person could claim a huge payday by handing her over. The hunters were always on the lookout. Harriet had to remain not just brave, but virtually invisible. And so she did. She changed her routes frequently. If she heard of heightened vigilance in one county, she would reroute through another, even if it meant trudging miles of marshland to avoid a town crawling with bounty hunters. She became adept at reading the subtle cues of danger, a sudden influx of strange men in an area, or an overly interested stare from a local would make her postpone a departure or take an unexpected detour. Her ability to sense traps kept her steps ahead of those trying to predict her moves. As the decade wore on, the stakes grew higher. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 had already forced Harriet to guide her groups all the way to Canada, as even the northern free states were no longer safe havens. Now, in the mid-1850s, with her name whispered both in hope by slaves and in anger by masters, every trip back into Maryland was more dangerous than the last. Yet the complexity of her operations only increased. She began carrying out rescues in deep winter to lower the chance of pursuit, sometimes using horse-drawn sleighs borrowed from allies to whisk escapees over frozen roads. In one operation, she escorted a group of 8 fugitives all the way to Canada, enduring blizzards and frostbite, never once letting any one of them fall behind. Feeding and hiding so many people on the move was a logistical nightmare, but Harriet pulled it off, utilizing every ounce of experience and every friend of a friend who could offer a barn or a cellar for a night. There were setbacks and sorrows along the way. In 1851, Harriet finally made it back to Dorchester County to find her husband, John Tubman, the man she had risked everything to come back for on that first return journey. To her heartache, she discovered that in the 2 years since her escape, John had given her up for dead or lost. He had remarried, taking a new wife. When Harriet quietly approached him with an offer to go north, he turned her down flat. He was not about to leave his new wife, and he seemed almost fearful of Harriet's bold intentions. Harriet was hurt deeply, but she did not waste the trip. Instead of returning empty-handed, she found others who yearned for freedom and led them out. That night, someone else's husband or wife or child got a chance at the liberty John Tubman refused. It was one of the few times she left behind someone she had dearly wanted to save. She swallowed her personal pain and kept moving, because there were always more people in need of deliverance. By 1857, Harriet undertook one of her most daring missions to rescue her 70-year-old father Ben Ross and her mother Rit. Her father, though technically a free man, had come under suspicion for aiding runaways. It was too dangerous to leave them behind. Harriet knew it was time to act. But freeing her elderly parents posed unique challenges. They could not slip through the woods on foot or hide in swamps. Her father was losing his eyesight, her mother was frail. Harriet had to use a different tactic. She procured a wagon and, disguising herself as a local farmer, drove her parents out of Maryland slowly and carefully. Under blankets and hidden from prying eyes, they crossed into Delaware and onward to freedom. When her father realized what his daughter had done, he wept with gratitude. Harriet Tubman had, by the end of the 1850s, directly rescued around 70 people from bondage. Each journey was a victory snatched from the jaws of dread. She later estimated that over 11 years, she made 19 trips into the South. Historians would document slightly fewer, but even at a dozen-plus expeditions, her record was astounding. And though she was often pursued, often within a hair's breadth of capture, she never once lost a fugitive in her care. As she famously said, with equal parts pride and piety, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." It wasn't bravado. It was fact. Every person who started a journey north with Harriet Tubman made it to freedom. Meanwhile, her enemies only grew more frustrated. Each failed attempt to intercept her. Each morning a master awoke to find empty shackles and no trace of the valuable slaves he'd owned was a blow to their ego and authority. They tried to adapt. They coordinated multi-county manhunts, circulated her description widely, even employed decoys to try to lure her into the open. Once or twice, they nearly had her. Shadowy accounts tell of a pursuer's bullet whizzing so close it tore a piece of her shawl, or of Harriet barely slipping out a back door as armed men surrounded a safe house. Whether embellished or true, such tales underscore how dangerous her work had become. But close only counts in horseshoes, as they say, and none of the slave catchers could ever lay hands on the wily woman called Moses. No matter what tactics they tried, she always seemed one step ahead. For all her successes, there were moments when the line between life and death, freedom and capture, wore dangerously thin. On one of these missions in the late 1850s, Harriet came as close to disaster as she ever would. It began with a betrayal. Harriet was leading a group of 5 freedom seekers northward. Among them a young mother, her infant child, and 2 strong field hands from a plantation in Sussex County. The journey had been arduous but smooth through the backwoods. By the time they reached the eastern edge of Delaware, everyone was exhausted. Harriet decided to risk a brief rest at a farm owned by a free black man who had been recommended by a contact. This man, whom they knew only as Lester, was supposed to be a friend to the Underground Railroad. He greeted Harriet's party warmly at his door after midnight, glancing nervously behind them as if to check they hadn't been followed. Inside, he offered them cornbread and water. Harriet, ever cautious, asked a subtle question, the password phrase given to her by the last station master, to verify his loyalty. Lester fumbled his answer slightly, but ultimately got it right. Harriet's instincts prickled. Something felt off in his delay, in the sweat on his brow. But what choice did she have? Dawn was approaching, and they needed shelter for the day. They settled in his barn, hiding among the hay bales in the loft. Lester said he'd keep watch. Just before first light, Harriet awoke with a start. She heard hushed voices outside the barn, voices that didn't belong. She peered through a gap in the loft boards. Down below, the barnyard was crawling with men carrying rifles and lanterns. At least half a dozen. Her heart pounded. It was an ambush. Whether Lester had willingly sold them out or had been coerced, it no longer mattered. The hunters were here, closing in fast. Harriet quickly shook each of her companions awake, pressing a finger to her lips in warning. The baby, as if sensing the danger, began to fuss. Harriet's hand darted to her pocket for the vial of opium, instinctively, calmly, just enough to wet the baby's tongue. The infant sighed and fell silent again. Below, a deep voice barked, "Check the loft." There was no time to lose. Harriet gestured to a small haymow door on the far side of the loft that opened out to the field beyond the barn. Quiet as shadows, she and the others slipped through it one by one. They dropped into the dew-drenched field just as a lantern's glow crept up the main ladder inside the barn. Crouching low, Harriet led them in a desperate crawl along a drainage ditch, putting the bulk of the barn between them and the posse to mask their escape. As they reached the tree line, a shout rang out behind them. The men had discovered the empty bed of hay where fugitives had lain moments before. Hounds bayed as they caught the scent. The chase was on. Harriet drove her party onward through the woods at a sprint. Shots cracked in the pre-dawn gloom, and a bullet whistled past, splintering bark off a pine just yards to their left. The slave catchers were close, too close. Harriet's charges were stumbling in terror, their confidence shattered by the sudden betrayal and pursuit. Branches whipped their faces. The young mother struggled to keep up with the sleeping baby in her arms. Harriet dropped back and took the baby from her, urging the mother and the rest forward. "Go! Don't stop!" She herself was bone-tired. She hadn't truly slept in 2 days, but she refused to let it slow her. Through thickets and tangles they crashed, Harriet making sure she was last in line, pushing anyone ahead who faltered. Behind them the hunters fanned out, whooping to one another to circle around. They were trying to flank her group before they could reach the Broadkill River, marshes ahead. Harriet realized their plan at once. The swampy marsh was both danger and salvation. If her group could plunge in, they might throw off the dogs and hide in the water and reeds. But the posse knew that too. They meant to pen her, and before she got there. Her mind raced through options even as her lungs burned for air. She had one more trick in her kit in a small pouch around her neck. She carried a mix of black pepper and mustard seed. As a boy, her father had taught her that a dash of pepper in a slave's footprints could thwart tracking dogs by irritating their noses. Harriet paused just a heartbeat, yanked the pouch free, and scattered its contents behind her along the narrow trail they were on. The fine grains settled into the mud and leaf litter. Moments later, the slave catcher's hounds hit that section of trail and yelped in confusion, snorting and pawing at their snouts. Harriet heard one handler curse, "Damn dogs have got the sneezin' fit." The pursuit faltered ever so slightly, just enough. Harriet and her group burst out of the tree line into the marshlands as a pale dawn broke. Clumps of high grass and cattails spread before them, threaded by channels of dark water. Without hesitating, Harriet splashed into a stagnant creek, motioning the others to follow. They waded waist deep into the muck, pushing through tangled reeds, putting as much marsh between themselves and the solid ground as possible. Finally, when they were perhaps 100 yards in, far enough that only the tallest silhouettes could be seen from the tree line, she signaled them to stop. They huddled down, half submerged among the tall cattails and soggy hummocks of mud. Minutes later, the slave catchers arrived at the edge of the marsh. Harriet could make them out through the lattice of vegetation. shapes of men moving cautiously, frustrated shouts as they realized the tracks led into this forbidding swamp. One of the dogs, still whining from pepper, put its paws in the water but then backed out, unwilling to plunge into the deep muck. The men fanned out along the bank, shining lanterns, and peering into the sea of reeds. Harriet's party froze. Several of them were trembling violently from cold and fear. The young mother's lips were quivering not just from chill, but from the effort of holding back sobs. Harriet squeezed her hand in silent reassurance. The baby in Harriet's arms was still asleep, oblivious to the danger mere yards away. A heavy, set tracker in a brown coat took a few steps into the marsh, testing the footing. He sank past his ankles and cursed. "Ain't no way they went far in that." Another called. "Maybe they doubled back?" Shouted a third. The posse regrouped, confusion spreading among them. Harriet's diversion with the pepper and the daunting prospect of slogging blind through a swamp had given them pause. But Harriet knew they weren't safe yet. All it would take was one braver man, one stray dog catching a whiff of human scent across the water, and the hunt would surge toward them. Harriet's group hunkered low in the murky water. Time crawled. The sun inched higher, bringing feeble morning light that glistened on the wet reeds. Harriet's legs were numb, buried in cold mud, and beneath the surface she could feel leeches clinging to her skin. The others were in similar straits, exhausted and shivering. Hours passed with no change. The catchers held their ground, even calling for reinforcements from town to help flush out the runaways. The runaways fighting for freedom, and the men fighting to preserve their wages and pride, were locked in a grim stalemate across the wetlands. As the afternoon light waned, Harriet's eyes finally fluttered open. She awoke to a scene of misery, her people hunched around her, gaunt and terrified, lips blue from cold, yet still steadfastly keeping guard. She realized she must have been out for hours. Shame and anger at her own body's betrayal welled up in her. But there was no time for self-reproach. The situation was dire, but not hopeless. Not yet. Dusk was approaching, and with it, darkness would return, Harriet's old friend. She knew that once night fell, they might have one last chance to slip the noose. But how? The swamp was still surrounded. As Harriet's mind cleared, an idea formed. It was risky in the extreme, but it was all they had. She whispered her plan to the others, and a few faces flashed astonishment in the waning daylight. Was she serious? She was. It was time to turn the tables. The hunter and the hunted were about to trade places. Night fell over the marsh like a blanket of mercy. As the last glow of twilight vanished, Harriet Tubman put her daring plan into action. She had observed that the slave catchers, for all their determination, were only human. They were soaked, hungry, and angry. She wagered that by full dark, some of them would retreat to dry ground to regroup, likely back to Lester's farm or a nearby tavern, to get a hot meal and rest, leaving just a token watch behind. It was exactly what Harriet would do in their shoes, and she was counting on it. First came a diversion. One of the men in Harriet's group, the stout field hand who had steadied everyone during her faint, volunteered to create a false trail. He silently slipped away to the east, skirting the marsh, and then made a deliberate racket, snapping branches and splashing loudly, as if a group were trying to break out in that direction. Almost immediately shouts rose from the posse's campie. "Over there! I hear 'em!" Lanterns bobbed and dozens of boots tromped toward the noise. Harriet's decoy melted into the darkness long before the hunters arrived, and he doubled back safely to rejoin the others. But the damage was done. Most of the enemy had rushed off toward the phantom sound, thinking their quarry was making a desperate run. That left only 2 men, still guarding the section of marsh where Harriet's party hid. Those 2 had grown careless after hours of nothing. In the commotion of their fellows chasing the decoy, the remaining pair wandered down the path a bit, peering toward the shouting in the distance. In that moment, Harriet quietly ushered her group out of the water and onto solid ground on the opposite side. Dripping and mud-stained, they moved single file through the trees, hearts pounding but footsteps soundless. In minutes, Harriet had led them around the far flank of the distracted search party. They were free of the swamp entrapment. Harriet did not head due north just yet. She had one more piece of business. Lester's farmhouse lay silhouetted against the starlight a half-mile away, and from its windows glowed a flicker of firelight. As she suspected, the slave catchers had withdrawn there to dry off and plan their next move. Creeping through the farmyard, Harriet could see the men milling inside the house and around a fire outside. They looked weary and irritated, swatting at mosquitoes and grumbling about the elusive prey. Lester himself was ladling something from a cauldron over the fire. Stew or porridge to feed the hungry poss. Harriet's jaw tightened. This was the man whose treachery had nearly doomed them. Yet, perhaps he could still be useful. Leaving her group hidden at the edge of a cornfield, Harriet slunk toward the outdoor fire, where a couple of the catchers were waiting bowls in hand. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool earth. Lester was alone for a moment, bent over the cauldron with his back to her as the men stepped away to fetch more rum. Seizing the chance, Harriet stepped out of the shadows and pressed the muzzle of her revolver into Lester's ample side. He went rigid. Before he could cry out, Harriet hissed, "Not a word. You've done enough talking for one day." Lester's eyes stretched wide in terror, recognizing the petite, mud-splattered woman at his side in the firelight. Miss Tubman." He stammered. "Hush," she whispered fiercely. "You're going to fix what you've done. Stir that pot, and when I tell you, you're going to pour in this." From her pocket, Harriet pulled the small leather pouch she had retrieved from the marsh. A pouch that had once held the opium tincture. Its contents now were the last few drops of laudanum diluted in water and mixed with the scrapings of a certain wild herb Harriet's father had taught her about. A plant that could cause a deep, drowsy stupor if enough was ingested. It wasn't much, but concentrated as it was, it might do the job. She gently emptied the liquid into the bubbling stew, stirring with Lester's ladle to blend it thoroughly, all the while her pistol stayed firmly pressed into Lester's ribs. "Serve them plenty," Harriet ordered in a low tone. "And don't even think about warning them. If just one of them stays awake tonight because of you, I will find you." With that, Harriet melted back into the darkness, unseen by the returning men. She rejoined her companions in the cornfield and motioned them to stay low. From their hiding place, they watched the men eat. Soon the half-starved poss were gulping down the hearty stew, passing around tin cups of rum to wash it down. As the fire crackled and bellies filled, the adrenaline of the day began to ebby. One by one, the slave catchers' heads began to nod. Some stretched out right there on the porch, others stumbled indoors to find a chair or bed. Lester moved among them, offering extra ladles to the stragglers with a convincingly hospitable smile, but Harriet could see his hands shaking from afar. Within a half hour, the entire gang of hardened men was sprawled about in various stages of unconsciousness. A couple tried to rally themselves, toasting, "We'll get M in the morning." But their words slurred and eyes drifted shut mid-sentence. Soon, the only sounds were the incessant chirp of crickets and the chorus of snores from defeated pursuers. Harriet waited a little longer, just to be safe. When she was certain all were in a drugged slumber, she crept forward again. Her companions followed silently, stepping around the slumbering men with a mix of astonishment and giddy relief. Here lay the fearsome slave catchers, sprawled in the dirt and on porch swings like children, in too deep a sleep to wake. The rifles that had been poised to kill them hours before were propped carelessly against the wall, now within easy reach. But Harriet had no interest in vengeance, only escape. She quietly motioned her people past the house. As they moved beyond the farmyard, they could see the men's horses tethered to a post. In a matter of minutes, Harriet had two of the field hands hitch those horses to an empty wagon left in the yard. The group climbed in, gratefully, for their feet were cut and swollen, and Harriet took the reins. The sleeping men never stirred as the liberated wagon rolled out. By the time the first of the drugged catchers cracked open a groggy eye the next morning, Harriet Tubman and her charges were over 20 miles away. That night, as the wagon rumbled north under the stars, those huddled in its beds slowly realized that they had entered the day as the hunted and ended it as the victors. The slave catchers had thrown everything at Harriet Tubman. Numbers, weapons, dogs, traitors, and she had quietly, almost gently, turned it all against them. Not a drop of blood had been spilled. Yet an entire posse lay defeated, outsmarted to the point of literal unconsciousness. Harriet's companions looked at her, some with open awe, as she drove the wagon onward through the night. She was uncharacteristically silent, her face set like flint, eyes scanning the road. Only when the lights of a friendly safe house appeared in the distance did she allow a small, tight smile. She had won. Once again, against all odds, she had won. When dawn broke this time, Harriet Tubman and her wary but jubilant group were safely across the Mason-Dixon line, rolling into the welcoming arms of Pennsylvania. Behind them, they left a scene of utter bewilderment. The slave catchers awoke at Lester's farm in disarray, heads pounding from the drugged liquor, tempers flaring as they realized their quarry had vanished completely. Some blamed each other, accusing one man of falling asleep on watch, another of drinking too much. Lester, perhaps fearing retribution, claimed ignorance and swore the runaways must have had hoodoo magic to escape. The men found their horses gone and their pride along with it. All they could do was send a sullen message back to their bosses. Moses had slipped through their fingers once again. They had nothing to show for all their efforts but mosquito bites and empty bowls. It was a defeat they would not soon forget, though they scarcely understood how it had happened. For the rest of their lives, none of those men would publicly admit that a group of fugitive slaves, led by a diminutive woman, had made fools of them. But in their private nightmares, perhaps they remembered the darkness, the swamp, and the way that woman's shadow moved through their plans like a phantom, leaving them dazed and powerless. Harriet Tubman's victories were quiet, the stuff of midnight whispers and secret celebrations, yet their impact on the oppressor's psyche was profound. With each family she stole away, she chipped at the foundation of an entire system's confidence. In the slave quarters, her name was spoken reverently. Moses carried off more tonight, they would say when they discovered a cabin empty come morning. In the plantation manor houses, her name, or the rumor of that elusive Moses, was uttered in frustration and dread. A single woman, unaided by any army, had made the almighty slave catchers look inept. What else might be possible? By the end of the 1850s, the legend of Harriet Tubman loomed large in the American South. Runaways she had guided would recount stories of her cunning to others in bondage, fanning the flames of hope. Enslaved men and women began to believe that flight was not a fool's errand after all, not if Moses was leading the way. Plantation owners noticed this subtle shift. Those they held in chains were no longer as resigned, no longer as docile under the yoke. Why would they be, when it seemed that every few months came news of another daring escape, another loss of valuable property, without a shot fired? Harriet's very existence was a challenge to the core lie that kept slavery alive, the lie that the enslaved were helpless and the masters invulnerable. The masters tried to strike back in the only ways they knew. They raised the bounties on runaway slaves, and especially on the woman called Moses. Posters and newspaper notices screamed for her capture, adding lurid embellishments that made her sound like a dangerous bandit rather than a liberator. Yet no informer ever turned her in, no hunter ever claimed that reward. She seemed to vanish into thin air whenever the net tightened. Each failed manhunt was more than just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological one. The slaveholders had poured money, manpower, and vicious intent into catching this woman, and they had nothing to show for it. In their anger, some convinced themselves that Harriet Tubman had to be backed by powerful Northern abolitionists or secret societies, or even that she possessed supernatural protection. How else could a lone illiterate woman outwit dozens of men time and again? Stories whispered that she could turn herself into a bird to evade capture, or call down the fog to cloak her flight. Absurd tales, born of frustration and fear, but revealing in how they acknowledged her prowess. On the plantations of Maryland's eastern shore, owners grew paranoid. They forbade their slaves from singing certain spirituals or congregating after dark, worried that these might be signals to Moses. They imposed harsher punishments at the slightest hint of disobedience, hoping to quash any spark of rebellion. But these measures only betrayed their own alarm. The more they tightened their grip, the more it slipped through their fingers. For every slaveholder who sneered that Tubman's escapees were just the unlucky few he could afford to lose, there was another lying awake at night, wondering if the next knock in the barn or the next shadow by the creek might be Harriet coming for his property. In truth, Harriet Tubman was not everywhere, and she could not free everyone, but to the embattled mind of the slave-owning class, she might as well have been. She became a symbol of something they had never truly believed possible: successful, smart, organized resistance from the very people they had subjugated. That thought was more frightening than any armed revolt. If one woman could unravel their schemes and spirit away dozens of slaves without ever being caught, what did that say about the future of their so-called peculiar institution? It said, perhaps, that its days were numbered. By 1861, as the nation hurtled toward civil war, the confidence of the Southern Slavocracy was cracking. Harriet Tubman had played no small part in that. Every bold escape she led was an omen that the old order was not as unassailable as it claimed. When the Civil War finally broke out, enslaved people by the tens of thousands fled to Union lines at the first chance, undermining the Confederate war effort from within. That flood of self-liberation was the same current that Harriet had been a part of for years, now swollen beyond any one person's doing, but undoubtedly inspired by pioneers like her who showed the way. Even before Union soldiers enforced emancipation, Harriet Tubman had eroded the authority of the plantation system, proving that enslaved people were not content and compliant, but eager and able to seize freedom if given half a chance. The idea of slavery's permanence had been shaken to its core. In the waning days of the slave catcher's reign, one could sense an aura of defeat clinging to them. They would still boast and bluster in the taverns about hunting down runaways, but their boasts rang hollow. Too many had slipped away. Too many chases had ended in empty swamps and mocking laughs echoing from the darkness. The smartest of the lot perhaps understood what was happening. The balance of power was shifting. They had tried to break Harriet Tubman's body and spirit, only to find that each time she emerged from the darkness, she broke theirs a little more. The slaveholders' world was trembling, and Harriet, though 5 feet tall and barely over 100 pounds, stood among those who had rocked it from below. Of course, at the time, these men would never have admitted such things openly. Pride and prejudice ran too deep. They cursed Tubman's name and insisted she would meet a bad end. But inwardly, many harbored a grudging respect, or at least a fear. They began to suspect that catching her was beyond their power. Some of those hunters eventually slunk away to easier jobs. Others died still vowing to get her, their vows unfulfilled. Harriet Tubman remained free, undefeated, an invisible general in a shadow war that she had effectively won. And when news came in 1863 that she had actually helped lead Union troops in a raid that freed hundreds more enslaved people in one night, the last vestiges of the myth of control truly crumbled. There was no going back. The confidence of the system had collapsed long before the system itself would follow. The Civil War would finally bring the legal end of slavery, and Harriet Tubman would play her part in that conflict too, serving as a Union scout, a nurse, even leading a raid that liberated hundreds more on a single night along the Combahee River. But when the guns fell silent and the Union emerged victorious, there was no great fanfare for Harriet Tubman. She received no parades, no medals from the government. In fact, she struggled for years just to receive a soldier's pension for her wartime service, continually having to prove the value of her contributions to skeptical officials. The nation that she had so profoundly helped to change barely acknowledged her. After the war, Harriet returned to Auburn, New York, where she had settled her aging parents during the fighting. Her life became one of quiet service. In poverty and in declining health, she still opened her home to others in need: the poor, the sick, the elderly. She cultivated a small piece of land, raised chickens, and whenever her funds ran low, she worked odd jobs or sold homemade pies and root beer to stay afloat. She took in boarders who had been formerly enslaved, sharing what little she had because that was her nature. There were no statues in her honor, no public holidays bearing her name. To the wider world in the late 19th century, she was largely forgotten or seen as a minor figure of a past era. But in her community and in the growing circles of Black Americans fighting for civil rights and women fighting for suffrage, she was revered quietly as a living legend. In 1913, Harriet Tubman passed away in the same modest way she had lived. On her deathbed, surrounded by family and friends in the home for elderly African Americans that she herself had founded, she uttered words from the Bible. "I go to prepare a place for you." There were tears and hushed prayers in that room, but outside it, the world carried on with little notice that one of its great souls had departed. She was buried with military honors in a small cemetery in Auburn, a final gesture of respect from those who knew her worth, but hardly a hint of the renown that would later spring up around her name. Harriet Tubman's legacy would not remain quiet forever. As years passed, her story spread and her heroism was finally recognized for what it was. Today, schools teach children about the woman called Moses, and monuments stand where none stood in her lifetime. But in the moments after her passing, there was no grand national tribute, and perhaps that is fitting. For Harriet Tubman never sought glory or praise. She had done what she did because it was right, because her conscience and her faith left her no alternative. She lived not for recognition, but for freedom. First her own, then everyone else's. In the end, there was no dramatic flourish to cap her life's work. Just a small funeral in a community that loved her, and a legacy that would grow in the decades after. Those who had laughed at her, who had called her insignificant, who had thought their power unassailable, they were proven wrong not in a moment of triumphant spectacle, but in the slow, inexorable sweep of history. Harriet Tubman's story is the ultimate rebuttal to those who believe any human can be owned or broken into submission. It shows that sometimes the greatest revolutionaries move in silence, that sometimes the humblest of people can change the course of the world. There was nothing lucky or random about what Harriet Tubman accomplished. Her victories were earned through courage, sacrifice, and an unyielding moral clarity. She was, in a sense, inevitable. An inevitable answer to an unjust system, a force of nature rising up to remind the world that freedom is an irrepressible human birthright. They had laughed at that black drifter once. They were not laughing anymore. She wasn't lucky, she wasn't random, she was inevitable.